Good day everyone, we are the group 4 and today we are going to report about the wars of extinction and the Lumad present accumulation and disposition, which is based on Arnold P. Alamon's book on Wars of Extinction, Discrimination, and the Lumad Struggle in Mindanao. We divided our video presentation into two parts, and this is the part 1, and the reporters will be Zia Maxine Hulagpos and Dan Tatoy. The group 4 members are the following: Tutu Ranel, Hulagpos Zia, Landayan Christine, Ochavo Lorangel, and Tatoy Dan Duaves.
Maayong adlaw sa tanan. I am Zia Maxine Solita Hulagpos, and I am going to discuss the wars of extinction. In continuation of the topic, Wars of Extinction, Discrimination, and the Lumad Struggle in Mindanao by Sir Arnold P. Alamon. Being a Lumad in this day and age seems to entail fighting the state's wars of extinction, in addition to the structural disadvantages they encounter in the modern social, economic, and political context. The Lumad have suffered several abuses of their human rights at the hands of governmental troops and paramilitary groups in recent years. These groups have been attacking indigenous leaders, indigenous villages, and indigenous schools non-stop. A brochure outlining the terrible circumstances facing Lumad communities throughout Mindanao was released in 2015 by the Manila Bayan ng Mindanao, a coalition of organizations. A series of horrifying events happened to the indigenous leaders and people which impacted the whole indigenous communities. Indigenous leaders are being targeted by a systematic and well-coordinated campaign. 71 indigenous leaders have been killed extrajudicially in the 6 years of the Aquino government. 56 of them, the vast majority, are Mindanao-based Lumad leaders. The most horrific and sad occurrence involving systematic attacks against indigenous schools happened on September 1, 2015. The public execution of indigenous leaders Junel Campos and Belo Sinzo, as well as the executive director of the school, Emerito Samarca, in front of a stunned community rounded up by paramilitary forces known as the Bagahat Bagani, precipitated the closure of the Alcadev, an alternative Lumad learning institution. The town watched as the two leaders were executed by shooting in front of everyone, while Samarca's body was later discovered in a classroom, strangled, and with his throat cut. Another unfortunate event was on September 15, 2015, while Olaking Olinan, a 15-year-old from the Talaandig tribe, and Obet Pabiana were going about what they normally do in the forest of St. Peter, Malaybalay City, Bukidnon. Armed men who were allegedly members of the Delamansi group shot and killed them. In another case, a 15-year-old boy was the only person there at the Pangantukan massacre on August 18, 2015, and he witnessed firsthand how members of the Army's 1st Special Forces Battalion murdered his father and other family members at close range, along with his father who was 70 years old and almost blind. Two of the people who passed away were minors. The military of the Philippines declared in a statement following the incident that the people who died were armed rebels. On June 14, 2015, a Lumad leader and two of his colleagues were massacred in another case, and a woman peasant leader and her husband disappeared in Davao's Paquibato district. According to reports, military personnel immediately killed local church leaders, Oligario Kimbu and Randy Carnasa, as well as Ruben Inlog, the leader of the peasant group. Nagkahiusang lumad, mag-uuma sa pakibato. Moreover, because of these unfortunate events, the indigenous schools and its Lumad students were highly affected. Across Mindanao, 87 Lumad schools face closure threats and 3 have already closed under tragic and traumatic circumstances, forcing more than 1,000 indigenous students to stop from their education. In the first 3 quarters of 2015, there were over 95 documented occurrences of attacks on schools. A school named after slain anti-mining and Italian priest Father Fausto Paps Tentoriu, operated by the Mindanao Interfaith Services Foundation or MISFI in Barangay White Kulaman, Kitaw-Taw, Bukidnon, have been subjected to harassment by village authorities who were encouraged by the Philippine military. The school was forcibly closed on October 23, 2015 at 10 a.m. by armed men who stormed in while 24 pupils and staff were in session in front of the native children from the Pulangion and Matig-Salug tribes, as well as their volunteer teachers. They demolished the gate and started to dismantle the school, leaving them greatly traumatized and shocked. Next, there are reports that the Department of Education, acting at the military's request, has closed the MISFI Academy and Salugpungan Tatano Igkanukon Community Learning Center schools. They aim to replace these schools with military-run establishments with para-teachers and staff. Senator Miriam Santiago, among others, has pointed out that this is blatantly illegal under the Constitution. Next, in Padiay, Sibagat, Agusan del Sur, another school catering to Manobo High School students was set on fire by armed men early on November 12, 2015. The cottage, which contained the school materials, books, and generator sets, in addition to accommodating the volunteer teachers, was completely destroyed. Serving indigenous youth from the Manobo, Banwaon, Higaunon, Talaandig, and Mamanwa tribes, it is an outpost of the Alternative Learning Center for Agricultural and Livelihood Development, or ALCADEV. In opposition to various forms of development aggression that threaten their way of existence, the 146 Lumad schools spread throughout Mindanao have served as a focal point and source of solidarity for numerous indigenous communities. Furthermore, the killings of indigenous leaders and peoples and the closure of many Lumad schools brought negativity to the indigenous communities. As a consequence of these attacks on the indigenous communities, whole communities' social, political, and economic lives have been disrupted. In the last 6 years, a number of human rights violations against indigenous people have resulted in the displacement of over 40,000 people from remote and impoverished communities. These violations include extrajudicial killings, intimidation, and harassment, state armed forces occupying public facilities, and sexual assaults against women, among other things. The Banwaon Bakwits from Balit San Luis, Agusan del Sur endured harsh living conditions in the evacuation facility in December 2014, which led to a number of deaths among the elderly and young. It was only in March 2015, following the community and support group's successful campaign, that they were able to return to their hometowns. Following the military's encampment within civilian residences, 52 families from two barangays inside the municipality of Lagonglong were evacuated in Misamis Oriental. In order to draw attention to their situation, they set up an evacuation camp at the provincial grounds in Cagayan de Oro City on June 4, 2015. After a month, when the military eventually left their communities, they were able to return home. On June 11, 2015, the whole Hikaunon community in Dalakutan, Cabanglasan abandoned their homes and set up a camp at the capital grounds to protest the murder of Frenny Landasan, a community leader, and the abuse they had been receiving from the paramilitary ground de la Manse. For the Lumad, in general, this historical and institutional marginalization has gotten worse recently. The violent attacks on communities, schools, and indigenous leaders are an attempt to break the resolve of these communities to oppose the introduction of these harmful extractive companies, particularly since public services do not reach these far-flung regions. Private schools are desperately required in these distant areas. However, these schools are currently being closed. Their leaders are being slain. Their entire community and indigenous ways of life are being uprooted, all in the name of the extractive industries. The emergence of paramilitary groups, many of which are made up of indigenous people, is a phenomena that occurs in the Philippines. Additionally, Executive Order Number 264 grants them the authority to conduct business. The impunity of these military and paramilitary organizations then befalls those who oppose their ambitious schemes. In sad reality, what has been going on is a war of extinction, as the state's machinery via its paramilitary and armed forces is ready to crush any indigenous communities that stand up to it or split them apart in order to free up territory for the unrestricted looting of lucrative resources. The Lumad are not just subjected to unfair institutional structures, their plight goes beyond that. The violent, systematic, and coordinated attempt to expel the Lumad from their ancestral lands and domain exposes a very unsettling truth.
Hello and good day. I am Dan Anthony Duavestatoy and I am responsible for discussing the cowboys and ranchers and the Manubo Kulangian of Quezon Bukidnon, as well as the blood for land. Okay, let's start. In the midst of so much abundance and technological progress, all these have been achieved always at the cost of indigenous people's existence and ways of life. Honestly, within the entire part of my discussion, this statement truly marked inside my mind and led me to a lot of realizations of how hard these people struggled back in time. And I can imagine how much tears have fallen and blood have spilled just for trying to recover or take back their own dominion from invaders. Okay, what are cowboys and ranchers and the Manubo Pulangeon of Quezon Bukidnon all about? So it is a narrative and a part of War of Extinction written by Arnold P. Alamon. It involves pure conversation with some datus and some elders about their history, a tragic story of cruelty in the history of the indigenous people and their community. It also contains his realization and presents a lot of strong opinions. It is a narrative of betrayal and resistance. But before we dive into our main goal for this discussion, let's define conquistadors first. So what are conquistadors? On positive note, they depict as tamers of the wild and feral. They also believe that they are catalysts for change who brought much needed civilization to uncivilize. It is based on the invader's point of view. On negative note, or based on the indigenous people point of view, so they are just invaders supplanted with their predatory and self-interest, like desire for power and riches. Although we can say that it's true that the changes they brought is for us to be able to cope up with the demand and the current strand of the modern world, we cannot hide the injustices, sacrifices, and the dark stories behind it. Okay, let's move on to our main topic, which is the story of Datos Agdahan's people suffering, which is this narrative is all about. It all begins when American colonials start to reign in our country, and Spanish mestizo businessmen start to scout or find areas for their resource expansion. So what is Spanish mestizo? So Spanish mestizo are people or businessmen assigned by new colonial rulers to pursue business opportunities in far-flung areas to expand their control over resources. So their main vision or their vision is to start timber, establish plantations, and create wide ranches. So where does it really begin? So these people first infiltrated the Lumad territories as loggers, and later they came as ranchers with cattle and cowboys. They invaded their forest territories to operate logging that destroyed the forest and the economic source of the Lumad communities. There were also transformation of lands of Lumad into private ranches and plantations. Thousands of hectares of land are taken that causes immense suffering to Lumad people. They also fence out Dato Agdan's people from their very own land. So what is the main purpose of these people? So these pioneering ranches and undergoing plantations are done with a sole purpose of generating wealth for their owners or leaders. So that's the main aim. So how do they treat the indigenous people at that time? They are more concerned with the life of their cattle and give more importance to it. And they treated indigenous people and associates to the degrading term less than human. So that's how they treat indigenous people back in times. What happened next? So they enforce rules and hold control over the Lumad ancestral territories and guard their plundered areas through their hired cowboys and impose injustice, threat, and instill fear to nearby Lumads. Like there are tales of Lumad folks being skinned alive, salted, and hung on trees to serve as their warning to others not to enter the fenced off areas. So over the years, the invaded territories are constantly ruled by these people and passed to their respective successors. Now let's proceed to transitions within this narrative. So the first transition, before they were called conquistadors. Now they proclaim themselves as landowners, and they have been controlling the vast area for generations to generations through their injustice and feudal ways. So the next transition is from cowboys to guards. So the Lumad continued to resist against the ranchers, but later they guarded their fenced, plundered areas with armed private guards and tasked them to remove all the impediments to the expansion of plantations in the area. So the third transition is continuous threat and elimination. So despite the continuous threat and abuses by these invaders, the Lumad still choose to stay because they have nowhere to go and they cannot just leave their ancestral land. Now, who's Dato Agdahan? So Dato Santiano Agdahan, or the Manubo Ulangion tribal leader and one of the elders the author had a conversation with. So since I mentioned earlier that this is a narrative of a conversation between the Dato and the author himself, so for you to know, the conversation between the author and the Dato was actually happened atop of the hill called Bagalbal in the area they called Kiokong. So here's the complete narrative on conversation between the author and the Dato Agdahan. I chose this part because I think it was the most highlighted part in the entire narrative. So let me read it for you. I conversed with Dato Santiano Agdahan of the Manobo Polangion tribe atop of a hill overlooking the vast and verdant valley that is Quezon, Bukidnon, whose forests and rivers used to be their tribe's source of sustenance. Here were their roots as a people, he told me while looking wistfully at the land that they no longer enjoy. Below us was a procession of howlers carrying loads upon loads of harvested cane for the sugar mills, stirring up apocalyptic dust behind their trail. So I can't help but think that this might as well represent the riches stolen from the Lumad by those who took their land through cunning and violent ways. So for the information of everybody, the hill used to be a ritual site for Manobo Polangion, a focal point of their indigenous beliefs and solidarity before. Now it became their observational post. In the end, the Dato emphasizes that they are not convinced through negotiations like through crates of sardines or a gift of a pair of pants. After all of those happenings, they believe that they were eliminated through violence. Next, let's move on to our next main topic, which is the blood for land. So let's begin with the origin of Manubo Pulangion. So the oral tradition among the Manobo Polangion trace their people's roots to Apo Mamalu, who came from the seas with his brother Tabunaway. So it is said that when Islam arrived in Mindanao, the descendants of Tabunaway became Muslims and settled in the Great Plains of Maguindanao, while Apo Mamalu's people decided to go further into the center of the island following the river Fulani. Their name as Manobo Pulangion came from the Manobo term Impulani, meaning center of the island, a name they share with the great river which traverses the center of Mindanao to flow into the plains and marshland of Maguindanao as well. That's according to Pasague 2015. Now, let's understand how wide is the Manobo Polangion's dominion. So, the dominion of the Manobo Polangion tribe, therefore, covers a wide expanse of land from what is known as Carmen, North Cotabato to Quezon and Valencia, Bukidnon. So, that's how wide the dominion of Polangion, Manobo Polangion. So, let's also understand the cause of Lumad's dispossession of their ancestral domain. So, the introduction of formal bureaucracy, that's the main reason. So, they believe as civilization. So, that the American colonial government also brought into the area facilitated further the disposition of the local indigenous population ancestral domain. So because of this movement of civilization, the indigenous people are affected. Anyway, what is Kyokong? Kyokong is the ancestral domain claimed of the Manobo Pulangion, so or in the present day called Butong, Quezon, Bukidnon. It was part of the former Montalban Ranch estate. Now, who are these Spanish mestizos? Are actually these Spanish mestizo families, and it is represented by two big families. The first family is Manuel Fortich Sr. and his heirs, and then the Montalbans by the 1960s. According to Dato Andong Agdahan, retrieves from the oral history of their tribe, the story that his forefathers share to them is that the two datos, Mandaghaan Anglao and Manragnas Agdahan, lent gipahulam the area Kyokong first to Manolo Fortich. Manolo Fortich is the Spanish migrant settler family in what was ascertained to be the American period. So the first governor of the newly constituted province of Bukidnon in 1914 under the American colonial period. He was also the instrumental in transforming the Bukidnon landscape into ranches and agricultural plantations together with his American principles. So what happened onwards? So the indigenous people continuously were fooled, accused, punished, threatened, and deprived. So they are barred from their own ancestral domain permanently. So the memory of this betrayal cut deep and was passed on through oral tales of the Manobo Pulangion from one generation to another, such that when their hardship as a people became intolerable, they came together to take their land back. They used to be a proud, self-sufficient people, and yet they are now relegated as seasonal farm workers, toiling on the land was supposed to be theirs in the first place, or forced to farm on rocky mountain slopes. Now let's proceed to the last part of my discussion. So I simplified most of them through timeline style in order for us to save time and avoid confusions. So this timeline is possible, or this is a series of events was possible through the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, or IPRA. So let's start in 2009. So in 2009, Dato Andong's maternal side of the family under the Quezon Manobo Tribes Association, or the QUEMTRAS, so under the leadership of Dato Carlito Anglao, was able to secure a certificate of ancestral domain title for about 2,000 hectares. So in 2008, just before the expiration of the Agroforest Farm Lease Agreement, or the AFFLA number 123, entered into by the Montalbans with the government through the then Ministry of the Environment and Natural Resources from 1983 to 2009. So the heirs of the Manobo Pulangian, through the leadership of Dato Agdahan, undertook their first steps in claiming back their ancestral land by organizing themselves under Tinduga, or the tribal indigenous oppressed group, and filing for an ancestral domain claim. So they are joined by 8 other head claimants in order to secure 100 hectares from the Rancho Montalban estate. In 2011, Manobo Pulangion tried to move back to the Bagalbal area, but thwarted by Montalban's private security guards. So they decided to encamp in a nearby lot, establishing makeshift houses from 2011 to 2014. So besides the BC road connecting the province to adjacent Davao. So the unity of the Manobo Pulangian to assert their rights in reclaiming their ancestral land through visible collective action reap themselves dividends because it forced local politicians and government agencies to respond through their issues. Let's move on to the succession of pooling. So, despite the expiration of their agroforest farm lease agreement in 2009, after the death of the Patriarch Robert Montalban, the management of the ranch was passed on to nephew Pablo Poling Lorenzo, and still wanted to maintain their hold over the land. So, Poling Lorenzo sought to divide the claimants by convincing the awardees to lease back the land to him for a minimal yearly fee per hectare. So, for the sake of facilitating the expansion of the Del Monte's pineapple plantation. So, this is the reason why the claimants are presently divided into two groups. So the team A is composed of the Lumad, who have agreed to Poling Lorenzo's terms, and the team B includes Dato Andong and the rest of the Tinduga group, who prefer to toil on the land themselves instead of leasing this to unscrupulous businessmen. So the team A maybe agreed because they are tired of this cruelty. So they agreed somehow. So in September 2012, they held a protest outside the office of the National Commissions on Indigenous Peoples, or the NCIP, in Malaybalay City, Bukidnon. Last March 2013, they attempted to occupy the 28 hectares lot that was awarded to their group under the CADC. Then from October 16 to 21, 2013, they camped out at the Department of the Environment and Natural Resources Regional Office in Cagayan de Oro. On April 23, 2014, under the Certificate of Ancestral Domain Title number Arten QE Quezon or QE 0712-159, also are so under the Certificate of Ancestral Domain Title, Dato Agdahan and Tinduga thought they had finally won when they were set to be installed by officials of the NCIP on their claimed land. However, it was a scam. So why it was a scam? So instead they get the written total area. Instead nga makuha nila ang katong total area nga na ilahang napasaka, ang nahatag lang sa ila is 10 hectares, and ang nahatag pagid sa ilaha is the areas where kanang dili siya suitable for kanang agricultural aspects, because batuhon, bakilid, pangpang. So it was considered to be a scam, especially for the indigenous people. So for us to be aware, during this movement, there are already a lot of underlying issues of casualties happening simultaneously. So and the first casualty of the Tinduga struggle for land and life was Mabini or Tata Biato. I think everyone is familiar with this. Kanang nabalita na ni siya sa una sa TV. So, during the long drawn drought of 2014-2015, the community was hard pressed to expand their collective farm to be able to feed their families. So since March 16, 2015, they have engaged in bungkalan activity to it is an activity to assert their right over portion of their ancestral domain claim that is still fenced off by the Montalban Ranch. So 200 members of the organization had been crossing the fence of perimeter to expand their cultivated farms as a desperate measure for food. So on the morning of March 24, 2015, about 30 armed men opened fire at them, killing Beato and wounding 2 others. So that was the first casualties of faced by Tinduga organization on filing or on movement on reclaiming their ancestral domain. And the rest of the casualty will be mentioned or already mentioned by the first reporter and will be mentioned by the next reporter. That would be all. Thank you.